Hello everyone from Cranbrook, Kent in the southeast of England. I'm Kevin Adkisson, curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research at Cranbrook Educational Community in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. You don't have to know a lot about geography to know that Michigan and the southeast of England are not particularly close. I'm here on a research trip to explore the namesake of my Cranbrook Educational Community, and the family that immigrated from this market town to North America in 1844. I want to share with you what it's like here in this village. The name Cranbrook itself derives from the Old English term Cranbrook, or the Crane Marsh, and there's a series of rivers and tributaries that run through this part of the country. It's called the Kentish Weald, or forest, and it's really a spectacular part of England. Now, the cranes that gave this market town its name were probably herons, but that doesn't matter. There's archaeological evidence of settlements here since Roman times, and the market town has had the name Cranbrook in some form for over 1,000 years. There's also a Cranbrook school here, which is over 500 years old and was chartered by Queen Elizabeth. But what brought me here is tracing the roots of our community in North America to this town. As we get closer to the main high street, we're passing a lot of ancient buildings. They're built in the style of Kent, with white clapboard, red brick, and then red mathematical tiles. On our right, we see the schoolhouse. This is where a wealthy merchant, John Blueberry, left his home and fortune about 500 years ago to build a school for poor children. Mr. Blueberry's house was torn down in the Georgian period, and this schoolhouse was built. That's now where the school headmaster lives. And then right next to it is this fabulous Victorian building where now the school library is housed. Cranbrook School in Kent is an American public school, though it does have boarding students, and it has about 75 acres, making it bigger than the town of Cranbrook. It's also divided, like most English boarding schools, into houses, and here's an arts and crafts style house looking back at the campus. Now, between these two buildings, we see the Union Windmill. We'll walk up to the windmill in a moment. It's now the only windmill in Cranbrook, but at one point there were over 17 windmills, and this was a really productive village in medieval times. Edward III brought over Flemish weavers to start an English broadcloth industry, and it was broadcloth, or sort of rough woolen cloth, that made the market town of Cranbrook into a center of power, into a market town, and into a center of wealth. I think it's a wonderful parallel that weaving and textiles are such an important part of Cranbrook Educational Community's history, and then our roots here in the market town of Cranbrook being also tracing back to textiles. Now, we've made it to Stone Street, which is leading up to the very center of town. But before we go there, I'd like to cut down towards the Union Mill. On the right, what's now a parking lot, was the original Cranbrook Tannery, where leather was produced and boots were made. And I learned at the museum in 1851, Cranbrook won an award for its seamless leather boots that were made right here. And now we're seeing the windmill begin to pop up over the housing. And these red buildings that you see are a combination of both brick and mathematical tiles. And mathematical tiles are meant to modernize a building. They are shallow, they're attached with a nail or a brad. And what they would do is they would cover Tudor architecture, wooden and plaster architecture, with these tiles, so that you would have the appearance of a modern brick construction, but it's really a wooden building, versus this house is in fact a brick house. Behind me on the street is the Strict Baptist Chapel. The town of Cranbrook was a seat of religious dissent against the Anglican or Church of England. And there were all types of these small chapels with different sects of Protestant religion. And it was this seat of religious dissent that the Booths were a part of. Now, the Booths have been here in Cranbrook since the 1600s, but the start of our story really goes back to a George Booth. Now, you may know the founder of Cranbrook Educational Community, George Booth. This was his great-grandfather. His own dad had just died in the West Indies in the American Revolution, fighting for the British. And he was here in Cranbrook with his mother, a widow. He didn't have any trades, he didn't have any skills, and so his mom apprenticed him with the village coppersmith. And so George Booth became a coppersmith, making copper implements, copper tools for kitchens and for home. He made copper plumbing for bathrooms. He made copper washing equipment, as well as copper for the booming distillery business, because Cranbrook is a center of English hop production. And so all throughout the countryside, there is a need for copper implements for brewing beer. Now, George Booth is a coppersmith. His son, Henry Gough Booth, is a coppersmith. And it was actually here that Henry Gough Booth, his wife Harriet, were living in 1837 when Henry Wood Booth was born in this windmill cottage. Now, Henry Wood Booth is the father of George Booth, Cranbrook's co-founder. And the Booth family in Cranbrook lived in a number of spots around town, on this side of town, on that side of town, because they weren't terribly wealthy. They were renters, they were employees in another copper shop, and so they really had to move about to try and make it work. It would have been quite different living in the sort of early 19th century as a workman, as a laborer, like Henry Gough Booth and his father George and their family, than it was to be a businessman, to be head of one of the cloth industries. And the wealth of Cranbrook was really centered in very large houses like this. Again, a Tudor architectural building, a Tudor building, but covered now in a Georgian facade. And this house is part of a number of houses in Cranbrook that are home to major medieval cloth dealers that are still the sort of wealthiest, fanciest residences in the city. Like all of the architecture here in Kent, it is a layering of different styles. A medieval timber frame house covered in mathematical tiles and then given a Georgian door frame in the 18th century. We've come to this end of the street and we can now look back across the town and we'll see St. Dunstan's Church, the medieval parish church that anchors the other end of Cranbrook. Here, our view is dominated by the Union Mill. And the Union Mill went into operation around 1814, 1815. It worked all the way up until 1959 when it became a museum. It still spins today and is the landmark of Cranbrook. I don't know about you, but I don't generally associate England with windmill. But of course, these were industrial equipment. These were places of work and of production, of processing materials. And it was all the kind of resources that were found here in Kent that allowed Cranbrook to be a medieval manufacturing town. It was the right soil, the right sheep, the right water, the right wind and hills. All of this was exploited to turn Cranbrook into a very productive place. But that would all change with the Industrial Revolution. England undergoes enormous shifts in labor and production and the type of work that's happening. And people like the Booths, who were coppersmiths in a small market town, begin to need to seek new employment. Now, there were a lot of reasons that the Booths left Cranbrook. Combined with the economic changes, there was the religious aspect. They were religious dissenters, and throughout his life, Henry Gough Booth and Henry Wood Booth would search following ministers for the truth. And so they changed churches here in Cranbrook multiple times. They changed churches throughout their time in North America as well. But a really big motivation for leaving Cranbrook came tragically on Christmas Eve of 1841, when Harriet Wood Booth, George Booth's grandmother, died. She suffered from typhus. She had just given birth to their third child, and there were all sorts of diseases that were sweeping through the English countryside in the early 19th century. Now, the family has to pick up and they move to London first, thinking that's going to provide more economic opportunity and a more sort of stable family life. At that point, Henry Gough Booth remarries another woman named Harriet, who becomes a stepmother to the children. But in 1844, they decide that they're going to set out, like so many millions of Europeans, for a new life in North America. It takes them 6 weeks to get there, from May to June of 1844. They land in New York, and then over the next few years, we'll go from New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Buffalo, spend some time in Buffalo, and finally in Toronto. And it was in Toronto where George Gough Booth, the co-founder of Cranbrook Educational Community, was born. And as we get into the center of the town, I'll pause my story just to point out that what we're seeing here is all protected by the national government. This is a heritage area, and it really hasn't changed a whole lot since the 1840s when the Booth family lived here and left. It also hasn't changed a whole lot building by building or even sign by sign. And so I'll point out here the copper shop where the Booth family men worked. And it's anchored by this enormous copper kettle. And this copper kettle has hung here for close to 200 years. It was made by George Booth, the great-grandfather of Cranbrook's co-founder. And the first time they made it, they did serve something like 25 gallons worth of tea out of it before turning it into a sign hanging off of the copper's shop. And this is the sign that would have greeted George and Ellen Scripps Booth when they arrived to Cranbrook in 1901. Now, I mentioned that the Booths sort of struggle as they immigrate and as they travel around North America, serving in a number of jobs, mostly in the copper smithing industry. But George Gough Booth, the co-founder of Cranbrook, really made quite a fortune. He made his first fortune in the iron business, doing architectural cast iron, then another fortune in newspapers, and he also made quite a fortune when he married Ellen Scripps. Her father had been the founder of the Detroit Evening News and brought George Booth into the family business, newspapers. And George and Ellen were comfortable. They had 5 children. They lived in the city of Detroit. But George was really itching to reconnect with his English roots. Ellen had many family members, the Scripps family, who already lived in London. They lived in Kent. And so in 1901, they set sail from New York to come and visit Ellen's family, and for George to really trace his roots and to find out more about his father's early childhood, his grandfather's work as a coppersmith here, and even his great-grandfather's work making this copper tea kettle. We have pictures from that 1901 trip that George Booth took that show Ellen riding in a carriage through town. We see Ellen standing outside of this very shop. It's unchanged since 1901. We also have photos and notes of the family visiting this copper shop, which in 1901 was still a copper shop. And then the Booths did a pretty cool thing. That trip to Cranbrook was George, his wife Ellen, and his father Henry Wood Booth. And Henry Wood Booth was really just a boy when he left Cranbrook. he comes and he wants to know more about his father, and he wants to find work from his father's hand. And so he goes around town asking after copper kettles that may have been made by his father. And he actually finds a kettle that's incredibly similar to this one. And he purchases it from the daughter of the woman whose marriage in the 1830s the kettle had been made for. And the Booths, they sort of visit town, they see their family, they talk to people here, and they take back with them to Cranbrook, or to Detroit, all of these stories and that copper kettle. Now, when the Booths were here, they stayed right behind me. The George Hotel has been in business for over 500 years. Queen Elizabeth I stayed here in 1573, a visit to this important center of industry in broadcloth. This is also where George and Ellen stayed. And in Ellen Booth's diaries, we read about how much she enjoyed the hospitality, the quaint sort of charm of the market town, and even the food here at the George, which in her diaries, British food was not always Ellen Booth's favorite thing. I think this trip to Cranbrook, Kent really affected the Booths. Shortly after they returned, they began looking for property up north from the city of Detroit, and they would end up buying several hundred acres in Oakland County that they would christen in 1904 Cranbrook, borrowing the name of this market town to call their new family estate. Of course, they would then build their house, which they called Cranbrook House, and then in the 19-teens and 20s, they began the 6 Cranbrook institutions, which again borrowed from this market town. Because they not only borrow terms like Cranbrook itself, but they also borrow many of the different place names here, and that includes the parish church St. Dunstan's, which has been here for many, many years. The church that you're seeing is from the 1300s, the top of the tower from the 1400s, but more than that, there was actually a church religious structure here even older than the one we're seeing. And as we come to the sort of end of the market town, it is pretty small. It's only 6,000, a little more than 6,000 people who live here today, and it hasn't expanded a whole lot since medieval times. I want to end our tour here in the churchyard. It's a place of extraordinary beauty and serenity, and it's also a place where, as the Booths were beginning to reconnect their family to their English origins, they were wealthy people now. They were comfortable, they had been productive, they were successful. They were, George and Ellen at least, about to embark on the creation of one of the most interesting and important centers of art, education, and science in America. But they hadn't forgotten their roots here, and that is really evident in what I found in the churchyard. When Harriet Wood Booth died on Christmas Eve of 1841, the family didn't have enough money for a proper tombstone and burial. So in 1906, Henry Wood Booth came and gave his mother a proper headstone. We can see here, in memory of Harriet Wood, the beloved wife of Henry Gough Booth. And then here, at the bottom, we see it says, erected 1906 by their son, Henry Wood Booth of Detroit, Michigan, USA, born in Cranbrook, 1837. Now, there is a lot more to say about Cranbrook history. Both Cranbrooks are pretty cool, and both Cranbrooks have rich museums and archives in which you can learn either about this market town in Kent or the educational community outside of Detroit. As the curator of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, I try to bring you all of these fascinating stories, what makes Cranbrook Educational Community such a special and beloved place. It's not just the architecture and the art collections, it's not even just the classrooms and courses, exhibits that you can go and attend to. It's really about the people, and we wouldn't have Cranbrook Educational Community if it wasn't for the Booths, and if it wasn't for this, the market town of Cranbrook, Kent. Now, if you're just discovering this video, I encourage you to follow the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. or to go to our website, center.cranbrook.edu, to learn more and sign up for our newsletter about how you can stay in touch with Cranbrook. I also want to thank the sponsors of this trip who have sent me here to England to learn and to follow in the footsteps of George and Ellen Booth. The Polk family, Bobby, Stephen, and Ryan have been so generous in sending me here and allowing me to not only walk around Cranbrook, but to use the archives and to explore the collections and all of the connections between these two communities. Until next time, I'm Kevin Adkisson with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, signing off from Cranbrook, Kent. The crazy thing about being an American in a small market town is that if you spend an entire 5 days walking around with a camera, talking to yourself, people begin to both notice you and get very curious.